I keep a notebook. Not a journal. I want to be clear about that distinction, because a journal implies someone writing toward themselves, mining their own interiority for meaning. I'm not interested in my own interiority. I'm a county social worker out of Navajo County, Arizona, and I keep a notebook because details matter in my work in ways that feelings don't, and the moment I start mistaking one for the other, I become useless to everyone. Case notes. Interview summaries. Dates and times and the specific words people used because their specific words are evidence of something, though I don't always know what until later. I have used 7 notebooks in 4 years. 6 of them are in a box in my office closet. 1 of them is still in my truck. The last entry in that notebook is dated November 14th, and it says, Hector Vasquez doesn't know what he's doing. I wrote that at the end of a very long day, sitting in his driveway in the cold, listening to the sounds coming from inside his house, sounds I had not expected, sounds that did not fit any category in my professional taxonomy of situations. I wrote it and, then, I sat there for another 20 minutes not starting my truck. I want to tell you, I was wrong about him. I was wrong in the most specific possible way, the way where you're right about the surface and completely wrong about what's underneath it. He didn't know what he was doing. That was true. But what he was doing turned out not to need knowing. It ran on a different fuel entirely, something older and less articulable than knowledge, and watching it work was the closest I have come, in 4 years of this job, to believing that people are occasionally more than the sum of their available resources. I'm going to write this down properly. I've been putting it off because writing it down means I have to decide what it means. And I'm not sure I know yet. But here's what I know for certain. Hector Vasquez is a 60-year-old cattle rancher in the high grasslands outside of Heber, Arizona. He has a 7th grade education and a post office box because he doesn't trust mailboxes. He speaks English and Spanish and approximately 40 words of Apache learned from a foreman who worked his land for 18 years and died of a heart attack in the north pasture and is buried on the property because Hector felt the man deserved that. He had never, in 60 years, done anything the county would call remarkable. Then, October happened. Then, November happened. Then, the thing I watched, which I still don't have the right word for, happened. I'll start where I came in. The call came in on a Wednesday, mid-morning, routed through the county line and handed to me because I cover the rural districts east of Show Low and everybody else was already full. Anonymous tip, my supervisor said. Livestock rancher outside Heber. Says he's got a woman and 5 minors on his property, woman has an injury, kids haven't been in school. Caller didn't leave a name. Apache? I asked, because the demographics in that corridor tend in one direction. Caller didn't specify. I wrote it down in my notebook, Heber corridor. 5 minors. Injured woman. Anonymous. Then, I wrote, check water situation first, roads flood out there in October. I drove out the same day, which in retrospect was either professional diligence or a decision I made before I was conscious of making it, because the specifics of that tip, 5 children, injured mother, rural isolation, had arranged themselves in my chest in a particular way that my 7 notebooks of case experience recognized as urgent. The road to Hector Vasquez's property is approximately 9 miles of state route followed by 4 miles of dirt access that the county maintains in the loosest possible sense of that word. In October, after rain, those 4 miles take on a philosophical dimension. You drive them slowly, in 4-wheel drive, and you think about your life choices. I had plenty of time to think. The ranch itself sits in a bowl of high grassland, ringed on 3 sides by ponderosa pine and, on the 4th by a long slow rise that turns into mesa. It's working land, not decorative, not the picturesque West kind that shows up in magazines. The fences are mended rather than new. The outbuildings have been repaired so many times they become collages of different decades of lumber. There are cattle in the east pasture, the specific kind of cattle that look like they've been working for a living rather than posing for it, and a barn that leans approximately 12 degrees southeast and has been leaning that way, apparently, for 40 years. I've driven past properties like this my whole career and I have a shorthand for them. The man inside has been here longer than most things and plans to be here longer than most other things and does not especially need my input on that. I knocked. He answered fast, which meant he'd seen me coming up the road. Hector Vasquez was, and I am trying to describe this accurately, not cinematically, a man who looked like he'd been made from the same materials as his land. 60 years old, brown and weathered, hands that had been solving physical problems for so long they'd reshaped themselves around that purpose. He was about 5'9" and wore a canvas shirt with the elbows worn through and boots that were not making any apologies about their condition. He had a gray mustache and eyes that were dark and patient and already doing the math on why I was there before I showed him my badge. He said, in slightly accented English, "Social worker." I said, "Yes, sir. My name is Renata Fuentes, Navajo County Children's Services." "I received a report." "I know what report," he said. He didn't move away from the door. "Not hostile. Just occupying the space fully, the way people who have defended property before do without thinking about it." "Who called?" The report was anonymous. His expression indicated he had theories about that. He pushed the door open the rest of the way and said, "Come in." The inside of Hector Vasquez's house was, and I write this understanding it will sound like a thing I'm constructing for effect, but I promise it is accurate observation, full. In the sense of, not empty. In the sense of, occupied by a quantity of human activity that the space had clearly not been designed to accommodate and was accommodating anyway, with the particular chaotic dignity of a place where someone has decided to make things work regardless of architecture. There were shoes at the door. Children's shoes, 4 pairs small, 1 pair larger. A jacket over the chair that was not Hector's jacket. On the kitchen table, drawings, the crayon kind, scattered with the confidence of children who have been told the table is available to them. On the counter, a pot of something that smelled like red chili and masa, in the specific quantity of something that had been made to feed many people. A child appeared in the hallway. Boy, maybe 8. He looked at me with the serious assessment of a child who has learned to read adults for threat content before deciding how to react. Hector said, in Spanish, "It's fine, Manny. Go back." The boy went back. From somewhere in the house, a sound, younger children, the specific frequency of small people engaged in something competitive and approximately fair. The sound of a household with children in it. Not the careful sound of children who'd been told to be quiet because someone important had arrived. Just the sound of a normal morning. Hector pointed at the table. I sat. He sat across from me. He put his hands flat on the table, which I've come to recognize as the gesture of a man preparing to be honest. "I'll tell you what happened," he said. "And, then, you can tell me what you need to do about it." What he told me took about 25 minutes. He told it the way men of his generation tell things, without ornament, in sequence, with occasional pauses to make sure he was being accurate. He corrected himself twice. He looked at his hands while he talked rather than at me, which is not evasion, it's the way some people think. Here is what happened, as Hector told it, October 9th. He had been driving back from Heber Hardware Run, the usual, and, on the long straight stretch of Route 260 before the turnoff to his property, he had seen a vehicle on the shoulder. Not broken down in the dramatic sense. Parked in the sort of careful, deliberate way that means something is wrong but the person is still in control enough to make it not look wrong. He slowed. He stopped. He got out because, as he put it with no particular pride, that's a long road to leave someone on. The vehicle was a 2003 Nissan Pathfinder with a cracked windshield and a right rear tire that had been driven on flat for approximately 2 miles before she'd stopped, destroying the rim. The woman in the driver's seat was Apache, 30-odd years old, and had her left arm folded against her body in the specific way of someone managing a break or a significant soft tissue injury. In the back seat, 5 children, ranging from what he estimated as 4 to 13, all awake, all quiet, all watching him through the glass with the same expression his cattle used when they were assessing whether something was safe. He said, "You need help?" She said, "I need a tire." He said, "Your rim's done. That tire won't hold." She said, "I know." He said, "Where are you going?" She said, "Fort Apache." He calculated the miles. He looked at the children. He looked at her arm, the angle of it, the deliberateness of how she was holding it. He said, "I've got a ranch 4 miles from here. I've got a phone and food and a spare room. You come with me, get your arm looked at, your kids can eat, and, in the morning I'll take you to Fort Apache myself. She said, why? He seemed to find this question unusual. Not offensive, genuinely unusual. He told me, I didn't understand why she was asking why. He paused. Later I understood. She got in his truck. The 5 children transferred from the Pathfinder with the practiced efficiency of kids who have gotten in and out of strangers' vehicles before, which was a data point I filed immediately and returned to later. Her name was Suki Longbow. I'm writing that down because I've been careful not to, in my head, to keep her as a category until I had her as a person. But she was a person before I got there, obviously, and Hector had been treating her as one for 3 weeks by the time I knocked on his door, which put him ahead of me. She came out of the back of the house when Hector called her, moving carefully, her left arm in a proper sling now, a clinic in Show Low. He'd taken her on day 2, a fact he mentioned without ceremony as though it were simply the next logical thing in a sequence. She was compact and dark-haired and had a quality of watchfulness so refined it had become invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. She sat down at the table and looked at my badge and then at me. She said, "How did they find us?" I said, "Anonymous tip." "I don't know who." She said, "I know who." She didn't explain that. I wrote it down anyway, she knows who called. Doesn't want to say. I went through the standard intake questions. Children's ages, names, school enrollment, the nature of her injury, rotator cuff tear, not a fracture, clinic confirmed, being treated. Current custody status of the children, which was the question with the most weight in the room. 5 children, 5 different weight distributions shifting slightly in their chairs in the hallway where they were, I was certain, listening. She answered everything I asked. Directly, accurately, without performance. She had documents, actual documents, in a Ziploc bag she produced from somewhere, birth certificates, her own ID, medical records. She had been carrying those documents, it became clear, for a very long time. Not in anticipation of me specifically. In anticipation of a room like this one. A table like this one. A person asking questions she'd have to answer. I said, "Is there a custody situation I should know about?" She said, "Yes." She told me. I won't write all of it here because it belongs to her and not to this account. What I'll say is, there was a husband. There was a death. There was a family who had decided that death meant ownership, and Suki Longbow had a different view of that, and the space between those two views was the 400 miles she'd been driving before her rim gave out on Route 260. I asked if there was danger. She said, "Not here. They don't know here." I wrote that down. They don't know here. Not a lie, I'd come to believe that was true, but a sentence load-bearing enough to bend slightly under its own weight. After the formal part, Hector took me outside to show me his property the way ranchers do when they're not sure what else to offer and the land is the thing they're most confident about. We walked the perimeter of the yard, him pointing out where he'd done repairs, or he needed to, the barn with its permanent architectural opinion about gravity. I said, "How long have you been doing this alone?" He said, "My wife died 11 years ago. My son is in Phoenix. He calls Sundays." "And, you've been running this place?" "Yes." I said, "The children. How are they? How are you managing?" He stopped walking. He picked up a piece of fence wire from the ground, turned it in his hands. "You want to know if they're safe?" "Yes. They're safe." He looked at the wire. "The oldest one, Anna, she's 13. She's been helping with the cooking. I showed her the pantry and she's been managing it better than I do." A pause. "The little one, Cora, she's 4. She follows me everywhere. I don't know what to do with that, exactly, but she seems okay." "What do you do when she follows you?" He looked at me like that was a strange question. "I explain what I'm doing," he said. "She likes to know what things are for." I wrote that down. I wrote, "He explains things to her." It sounds small. In my notebook, next to case numbers and court dates and the blunt arithmetic of need and resource, it looked small. But I kept coming back to it the whole drive home. The specific image of this 60-year-old man going about his morning explaining his work to a 4-year-old who had decided he was worth following. The care required for that. The particular kind of patience it takes to slow down and say, this is the latch, and this is what the latch is for, and this is how you lift it. I did not close the case that day. I should be transparent about that. Professionally, what I found on Hector Vasquez's property did not constitute a situation requiring intervention. The children were clean, fed, housed, and in no apparent distress. The mother was receiving medical care. The living situation was, by the standards of emergency placements I documented that same month, comfortable. I closed the formal inquiry. I filed the report. I noted that follow-up would be conducted in 30 days per standard protocol. Then, I drove back out on Friday because I had questions I hadn't finished asking and I was going to be honest with myself about that. Hector opened the door and said, "I thought you'd come back." I said, "Is that okay?" He stepped back from the door. From inside, the sound of children, the smell of food, the particular acoustic texture of a house with people in it. He said, "You want coffee?" I said, "Yes." I went inside. There's a thing that happens in my job that nobody tells you about when you're studying for it, a thing that doesn't have a clinical name but that every field worker I know has felt, the moment when a case stops being a case and starts being something you're inside of rather than observing. It happened to me in Hector Vasquez's kitchen on that Friday in October, when Cora, 4 years old, enormous dark eyes, a habit of carrying whatever small object she'd most recently found that day, a bolt, chrome, thumb-sized, origin unknown, climbed into the chair next to me while her mother and Hector talked, and put the bolt carefully on the table between us, and looked at me with the expectation of someone presenting a gift and waiting to see if the recipient understood its value. I looked at the bolt. I said, "That's a good one." She picked it up and put it back in her pocket with the satisfaction of a collector whose taste has been confirmed. I looked at Hector, who was watching this from across the table with an expression I couldn't entirely read. Something behind his eyes that was doing its own private accounting. He caught me looking. He went back to his coffee. I wrote in my notebook that night, "Hector Vasquez doesn't know what he's doing." What I meant was, he doesn't know the name for it. He doesn't have a framework for it. He's not performing anything, not generosity, not heroism, not even basic human decency in the way people perform it when they know they're being watched. He's just responding to what's in front of him with the same pragmatic directness he'd apply to a fence that needs mending or a calf that's off its feed. The problem, the thing I sat in his driveway for 20 minutes turning over, is that some situations require more than pragmatic directness. Some situations require you to make a decision about who you're going to be when the hard part arrives. And the hard part, I was increasingly certain, was coming. I just didn't know what shape it would take. I came back the following Tuesday. I had told myself it was a follow-up visit, which is a thing social workers do, which is true, which was also, if I'm being honest with my notebook, and I am always being honest with my notebook, not the whole story. The whole story was that I had driven home on Friday with the image of Cora's bolt sitting in my head in the specific way that small things do when they're standing in for larger things, and I had spent the weekend doing my job on other cases and coming back to it without meaning to. I had questions. Not case questions. The other kind. Hector met me at the gate. Not because he was watching for me, he'd been fixing a section of fence line about 40 feet from the road, and he heard my truck and straightened up and waited with the fence tool in his hand. He had a smear of red clay on his jaw from where he'd apparently wiped his face with a dirty glove. He looked at my truck and then at me and said, "Any problems?" "No problems," I said. "I wanted to check in." He nodded. Went back to the fence post, and I stood beside him while he worked because standing beside a man while he works is sometimes the most efficient way to have a conversation with him. After a minute he said, "Manny's been helping with this." "The 8-year-old? He's 9 now. His birthday was Saturday. He worked the wire through the clip. He didn't say anything about it until Friday. I didn't have anything." He paused. "I drove to Heber and got a cake mix. Suki made it. We sang." I said, "How was that?" He looked at the fence post. He cried a little. The little kind. Not sad. I wrote that in my head because my notebook was in the truck. Not sad. What did you get him? I asked. I had some old rope in the barn. Showed him how to braid it. He tested the wire. He's been at it every morning. Made about 6 feet of it so far. No idea what he's making. Did you ask? He said he'd know when it was long enough. I stood there and watched him work and thought about a 9-year-old boy who'd had a birthday on a stranger's ranch in the middle of a life that had required him to move fast and hold on, and had cried the not sad kind, and was braiding rope in the mornings toward a goal he was holding privately until the rope told him what it was. Inside, things had reorganized. Not dramatically, the bones of Hector's house were the same: the scarred table, the wood stove, the row of hooks by the door that had held 1 jacket in October and now held 7. But the space had been claimed. Not taken and claimed, which is a different thing, the difference between a place that has been occupied and a place that has been inhabited. Suki had moved the kitchen things twice, by the evidence items in positions that weren't the original positions and weren't the new positions I'd seen on Friday, suggesting an ongoing negotiation with the space that was both practical and something else. There were drawings on the refrigerator. Cora's, primarily, she was prolific, apparently, and had an aggressive relationship with purple crayons. But one drawing in the top right corner was different, more careful, older hands. A horse, realistic enough to identify as such, with specific markings. I stopped and looked at it. Anna was behind me. I hadn't heard her come in. That's Senor Vasquez's horse, she said. Palomo. He's 17. I said, did you draw this? I used to draw horses. She said it with the slight distance of someone talking about a previous self. Before. I didn't ask what before was the before of. I said, it's good. She said, he let me brush him. A pause. Palomo. He stands really still. Does he? Senor Vasquez said he's always been like that. Since he was young. She looked at the drawing. He said some horses decide early that the world is okay and they just stay that way. She went back to the hallway. I stood there with the drawing for another moment. Suki was on the couch with her arm in the sling and a legal document on her lap that she was reading with the thoroughness of someone who knows documents can be weapons and prefers to be armed. I sat across from her. She said, without looking up, I've been waiting for the other shoe. What do you mean? He's going to want something. She turned a page. Everyone wants something. I've been waiting to find out what he wants. What if he doesn't want anything? She looked up then. Her expression was not cynical. I want to be clear about that, because cynicism is a posture and this was not a posture. This was the face of a person who has learned specific things from specific experiences and carries them as information rather than opinion. Everyone wants something, she said again. Softer. Even good people. I said, what do you think he wants? She considered that for a long moment. To be useful, she said finally. I think he needs to be useful and he doesn't have enough to be useful to anymore. She looked at her document. That's a good want. I can work with that. I asked Hector, that day, whether he'd thought about the long-term situation. He was at the kitchen counter making coffee. He stopped. He didn't turn around. I know it's temporary, he said. I didn't say that. You were about to. I sat with that. He was right. The custody situation in her case, I started. I know about it. She told you? Enough. He turned. Poured 2 cups. Set one in front of me. There's a man. Her husband's uncle. He's been making claims. Claims to the children? To her. He sat down. Her husband's family's position is that she belongs to them now. I know that's not, he worked for the right word. Legal. But it's not legal that's been scaring her. What has she told you about it? He looked at his coffee. Not much. The way people tell you things without saying the words. He turned his mug. She wakes up at 5 every morning. Checks all the doors. Checks the kids. Then, she makes coffee and she sits at the table and does whatever she does, her papers, her thinking, and by the time I come down at 6 she looks like a person who's been awake since 5 but made a decision that 5 a.m. is private. I said, and you let that be private? It's hers, he said simply. It was the third week when the trouble arrived, and it didn't arrive like trouble usually does, loud, obvious, demanding to be recognized. It arrived like weather that's been building for days. By the time you see it clearly, it's already overhead. I wasn't there when it happened. Hector called me. He called at 7:40 in the evening, which told me something, because Hector Vasquez does not call in the evenings. He said, a man came to the property today, while I was in the north pasture. I said, what man? He didn't give his name. Anna was in the yard. He drove up and got out and walked to the fence and asked if a woman named Suki was living here. Pause. Anna told him she didn't know any Suki. How old is Anna? 13. 13 years old, standing in a yard, a man at the fence asking the wrong questions, and she'd looked at him and said, I don't know any Suki. She came and found me immediately after, Hector said. She gave me a description of the truck, the plates, the man. She had it written down. A pause that had something in it. She'd written it down, Renata. I said, she knew to do that. She'd done it before, he said. That's what she said. She said, I've done this before. I sat with the weight of that. A 13-year-old girl who had already lived in a version of her life where knowing how to document a threat was a skill she'd acquired the way other kids acquire long division. Not traumatic in the way we perform trauma, screaming, crying, collapsing. Functional. Quietly, ruinously functional. I said, is everyone okay? Everyone's fine. Suki, when I told her she didn't, he stopped. She didn't react the way I expected. How did she react? She sat down. She said, how long do you think we have? Not, I'm sorry, or, I didn't mean for this to happen, or, we should leave. She sat down and asked a tactical question. Because the frightened part of her was already managed, already filed away in that 5 a.m. slot that was hers and private, and what she needed from the moment in front of her was information. Hector said, I told her she could stay as long as she needed. I said, what did she say? She said, are you sure? What did you say? A pause. I said I'd been sure of less important things, he said. The next morning I drove out. The children were at breakfast. Hector was at the table with them, which he hadn't been when I'd arrived on previous visits. He'd usually been outside by then, managing the morning, leaving the kitchen to Suki's domain. But he was there, with his coffee, and Cora was in the chair next to him with her bolt and 2 new additions to her collection, a washer and something I eventually identified as a small S-hook, and Manny was explaining something about braiding to his younger brother Eli that Eli was ignoring entirely in favor of his eggs. Anna was at the sink, washing dishes. With the focused deliberateness of someone who has given themselves a job because having a job helps them not think too hard about the thing they're thinking about. I sat at the table. I accepted coffee. I looked at the room. Hector looked at me. I looked at him. What passed between us wasn't exactly a conversation. It was a mutual recognition of the situation's new shape. The man at the fence had changed something, not the arrangement itself, which remained the same, but the air around it. The way you can feel a shift in a room's pressure before the weather arrives. He said quietly, while the kids were loud, I called my son last night. What did he say? He said, do you need help? Hector set down his mug. I said yes. He's coming Thursday. I wrote that down. I wrote, he asked for help. Because that, in my 4 years and 7 notebooks, was rarer than almost anything else I'd documented. The asking. The admission that the next thing required more than what he had. Not weakness. The other thing. The thing that looks like weakness from the outside and is something else entirely from the inside. Suki came in from the hallway, dressed and put together, her arm in the sling. She looked at me and she looked at Hector and she said, "I heard you call your son." He said, "I know you did." She said, "You didn't have to do that." He said, "I know." She sat down. Manny had stopped explaining braiding. He was watching his mother's face with the attention of a child who has learned to read it for weather. He looked at Hector. Hector said, "To the table generally, you want more eggs?" Eli said, "Yes." And Hector got up and made more eggs, and the kitchen filled back up with noise, and Anna at the sink stopped being quite so focused on the dish she was washing, and the moment, whatever it had been, passed through the room and out the other side and left something different in its place. Not safety. Not quite. Something related to safety, in the way a map is related to the territory it describes. I drove home in the late afternoon, the October light going gold and long across the grassland, and I thought about what Suki had said, everyone wants something. And I thought about what I'd watched Hector do at that table, not heroically, not consciously, just get up and make more eggs because a child said yes, and I thought maybe that's the thing she hadn't calculated for. Not wants nothing. Wants this. Wants exactly this specific unremarkable thing, a table with noise at it, a reason to get up and make eggs. Wants the life he'd been living without knowing that was what he'd been living without. I turned onto the state route and the grassland opened up on both sides, enormous and quiet and indifferent to all of us. My notebook was on the passenger seat. I didn't write anything. Some things need more road before they're ready to be words. Marco Vasquez drove up from Phoenix on Thursday. I know this because Hector told me, and because I was there when he arrived. I'd come out that morning on a pretext that was thinner than my professional ethics required, which was, I wanted to meet him. Marco was 34. He had his father's eyes and his mother's, according to a photograph on Hector's mantled build, which was slight and quick. He was in sales in Phoenix, the kind of sales that requires a truck nicer than his father's and a phone he looked at more than was strictly necessary. He came up the road in that truck and got out and stood next to it for a moment, looking at the house, and I watched him do the adjustment that adult children do when they return to a parent's property and find it changed, not physically changed, necessarily, but charged differently, humming with something new. He saw me. He saw my county truck. He looked at his father. Hector said, "That's Renata. She's helping us." Marco looked at me with an expression that had several things in it: relief that someone official was involved, suspicion of what official involvement might mean, and, underneath both of those, the oldest and most complicated of the three, the feeling of a son who had not been here and is now here and doesn't know yet whether that's too late or just in time. The first hour was not smooth. I'll be honest about that. Marco Vasquez loved his father in the uncomplicated way of people who haven't had to think about it because it's never been tested, and, walking into that house and finding it occupied, reorganized, inhabited by 5 children he'd never met and their mother sitting at his father's kitchen table with a legal folder, tested it. He and Suki had what I'd describe as a polite interaction that had all the warmth of 2 people deciding not to have an argument in front of witnesses. She assessed him with the same efficiency she assessed everything. He was trying to figure out, from her face, whether she was taking advantage of his father, and she could see him trying, and neither of them said any of it. Hector watched this from the counter and said nothing. The children, who had no investment in the adult tension, were immediately interested in Marco in the way that children are interested in any new person, particularly Cora, who appeared at his knee within 4 minutes of his arrival and presented him with her bolt. He looked at it. He looked at her. He said, slightly helplessly, "Is that yours?" She said, "Yes." She took it back and put it in her pocket. Something shifted in his face after that. Small, but I was watching. Hector took Marco out to the pasture after lunch, the way fathers take sons to the land when they need to have a conversation without walls. I stayed inside with Suki, which was the division of the afternoon that made the most sense and also the one I'd been angling for. Anna was doing homework at the table. real homework. She'd been enrolled in the middle school in Heber 2 weeks prior, an enrollment Hector had driven her to and waited outside for and driven her home from, all without ceremony. She was catching up on history, which she was apparently good at, and she worked with the quiet intensity of someone who has decided to be excellent at this specific thing as a form of control over at least one corner of her life. Eli and Manny were outside with Palomo, the 17-year-old horse who had decided the world was okay and intended to stay that way. Cora was asleep on the couch. Suki sat across from me and said, "He's going to try to talk his father out of it." "Marco?" "Yes." "Do you think Hector will be talked out of it?" She looked at her folder. "No. Flat, certain. But it's going to cost him something." The conversation. She smoothed a page. "I don't want him to pay that." "He's a grown man," I said. "I know." She closed the folder. "I've been taking notes on Hector Vasquez for 3 weeks. He is a person who does not process conflict externally. He'll do what he's going to do and not say anything about what it took to get there." "And that worries you?" "It worries me in the way that any unopened pressure worries me." She looked out the window at the pasture, where 2 shapes were visible, father and son, distant, moving slowly. "He's going to hold his ground with Marco. And then, Marco will go back to Phoenix and Hector will go to the barn and fix something that doesn't need fixing, and nobody will know what that conversation cost him." She was quiet for a moment. "I'll know," she said. "But I won't say anything. Because that's his." Hector and Marco came back from the pasture at 4 p.m. Marco looked like a man who has lost an argument he hadn't expected to lose. Not badly, he wasn't angry, wasn't sulking. But there was a recalibration happening in real time. He came in and washed his hands at the kitchen sink and stood there a moment with the water running, and Hector came in behind him and put on the kettle without looking at anyone, and the room held both of them at once and did not crack. Marco sat down. Manny came in from outside with rope. He was carrying approximately 3 feet of braid, still ongoing, the goal still private, and stopped when he saw Marco and said, with the directness of 9-year-olds, "Did you have a fight?" Marco said, "What?" Manny said, "You and Senor Vasquez. Did you fight?" Marco looked at his father. Hector poured hot water. He said, "We had a conversation." Manny considered this distinction. He seemed unsatisfied with it but willing to accept it for now. He sat down with his rope. Marco looked at the rope. He said, "What are you making?" Manny said, "I'll know when it's long enough." Something moved across Marco's face. Something quiet and a little undone, the way a man looks when a child says something that lands sideways and he doesn't know why it landed. He said, "Can I try?" Manny considered him. He handed over the rope. What Marco and Hector had said to each other in that pasture, I got the outline from Hector the following Monday, delivered in the flat voice he uses for things that cost him. Marco had said, "Dad, you don't know these people." Hector had said, "I know them now." Marco had said, "That's not Dad, that's not the same thing." Hector had said, "I know." A pause. "It's all I've got." Marco had said, "Someone is looking for her." That man at the fence, Hector had said, "I know." Marco had said, "What if he comes back?" What if he, Hector had said, "Then, I'll be here." Marco had been quiet. "Then, you're 60 years old." Hector, "I know how old I am." Marco, "Dad, Marco." Hector had stopped walking. He turned to his son and said, and this is as close to a speech as Hector Vasquez makes, "that little one. Cora. She follows me around the property every morning. She wants to know what everything is for. I show her." He turned back to the pasture. "I haven't shown anyone anything in 11 years. I didn't know I was missing it. Now I know. I can't unknow it." Marco had looked at his father for a long time. He had said, "I'm staying through the weekend." Hector had said, "Okay." Something happened on Saturday that I wasn't there for but that Hector described to me so precisely that I've been able to reconstruct it. The man, the one who'd asked Donna about Suki, came back. Not to the property. He parked on the road, outside the gate, in a way that was visible from the house. Just parked. Just sat. Hector saw the truck from the window. He stood there for a moment. Then, he went to the coat hooks and put on his jacket. Marco said, "Dad. Don't." Hector looked at him. "Don't go out there alone," Marco said. He stood up. "I'll come." They walked out together. Hector described this without emphasis: father and son walking out to the gate in the October morning, the grass still wet, their boots leaving tracks. The man in the truck watched them come. He was Apache, 50-odd, broad across the shoulders, with the particular kind of stillness in the face that means everything is being processed rather than displayed. Hector opened his gate. He stood at it. He said, "This is private property." The man said, "I'm not on your property. You're outside my gate. It's a public road." Hector said, "It is." He put his hands in his pockets. "What do you want?" The man looked past him at the house. "I want to talk to someone inside." "That's not going to happen today." The man's eyes came back to Hector. He looked at Marco. He looked at Hector again. He was doing the calculation. Hector knew he was doing it, measuring what was in front of him. He said, "You don't know what you're protecting." Hector said, "I know exactly what I'm protecting." A pause. The man said, "This isn't finished." Hector said, "Come back when you have the law with you." The man looked at him for a long time. He drove away. Hector and Marco stood at the gate until the truck was out of sight. Then, they walked back to the house. Marco's hands were shaking. Adrenaline, Hector said. His son had never been in anything like that, had grown up and moved to Phoenix precisely so he'd never have to be in anything like that. But he'd come out. He'd stood there. Hector noticed that. He didn't say anything about it. Inside, the children were at the table. All 5 of them, all still, all having done the calculation that children do when adults go outside for a reason and don't explain it. Suki was standing in the kitchen doorway. She'd seen from the window. She knew. She looked at Hector. He looked back. He said, "He's gone." She said, "For now." "For now," he agreed. Anna said, from the table, "Did you get his plates this time?" Hector looked at her. He said, "I did." She nodded. She went back to her book. Eli said, "Can we have lunch?" And, the moment the specific held-breath quality of it released, and Suki went to the kitchen, and Marco sat down at the table and picked up Manny's rope where he'd left it the day before and continued braiding, slowly, learning the pattern, and Cora climbed into Hector's chair while he was still standing and looked at him with those enormous eyes over the top of her bolt. He sat in the other chair. She handed him the S-hook, which she had never done before. Her collection was not for sharing, and looked at him with the solemn expression of a 4-year-old conferring something. He held it carefully. She watched him hold it. Satisfied, she took it back. "I came Monday." Marco was still there. He'd called his job, apparently, and done something involving rearranging his week, the logistics of which he described to me in a way that suggested he hadn't fully admitted to himself yet that he was staying because he needed to rather than because he should. I sat on the porch with him while Hector was inside. I said, "How do you feel about all of this?" He looked at the pasture. "I feel like my father is 60 years old and there's a man driving past his gate." A pause. I feel like I've been calling Sundays for 4 years and asking how he is and he says fine and I believe it because it's easier to believe it." He turned his coffee cup. "He is fine. I think he was actually fine. I didn't know fine was so close to not enough." I said, "It's not enough anymore." He looked at me. "No," he said. "It's too much, now." Something complicated in his face. I don't know if that's better. It was an honest thing to say. I liked him for saying it. He said, "Manny's rope is 12 feet long." Does he know what it's for yet? He said it'll be a lead rope. For Palomo. Marco looked at his hands. He asked my dad if that was okay. If Palomo could be his. A little. Just a little. He said just a little. I looked at him. He said, my dad said yes. He went back inside. I sat on the porch and looked at the grassland and the mountains beyond it, going gold in the November light, and thought about a boy who wanted a thing just a little, who had learned to ask for things in careful, diminished quantities, not greedy, not taking, just a small measured portion of the possible, and a man who had said yes without hesitation. Yes to the small ask. Yes to the just a little. As if there were no other answer. November came in like a deliberate thing. The grassland went gold, then brown, then the color that has no name, not quite tan, not quite gray, something specific to high country autumn that looks like the land has made a decision. The ponderosas on the ridge held their dark green, stubborn, the way old things are stubborn. The mornings started getting cold enough to see your breath. Cora decided that breath fog was the best thing she had encountered in her 4 years of life and spent approximately 2 weeks walking around Hector's yard exhaling with great deliberateness and watching the clouds she made. I know this because Hector told me. He told me a lot of things in November. Not because he'd become a different kind of man, he hadn't. He was still the kind of man who tells you facts rather than feelings and trusts you to do the rest of the work. But he called me more than he had before, and the calls were longer, and they had a different weight. Not worried, exactly. Not happy, exactly. Something in the register that includes both, the way a thing that matters produces both because it's too large to produce only one. The custody hearing was in mid-November. I need to be honest about my involvement here, because in 4 years I've always been clear about where my professional lane ends. I filed documentation supporting Suki's stability and the children's welfare at their current residence. I wrote the summary factually and completely. I drove Suki to the courthouse in Show Low because she had no reliable vehicle and Hector couldn't take a day off the ranch with a heifer in late pregnancy and Marco had gone back to Phoenix but said he'd come back Thursday, which was the day after. She sat in my truck on the way and looked at the road. I said, "Do you want to talk about it?" She said, "No." I said, "Okay." We drove in silence for a while. She said, "Anna asked me last night if we were going to leave." I said, "What did you tell her?" I told her I didn't know yet. She watched the road. She said okay. Just okay. She went back to her room. Suki's hands were in her lap, very still. She's never just okayed anything in her life. She questions everything. She argued with her second-grade teacher about long division. A pause. She just okayed it. I said, maybe she's learned to trust the process. She's learned not to hope too hard, Suki said. That's different. The judge was a man named Carver, which I mention only because his name is the kind of name that suggests something it doesn't deliver. He was not particularly decisive, not particularly warm, not particularly anything. He listened. He asked questions. He read the documentation. Suki answered everything in her compressed, factual way, giving information like she was handing over documents rather than pieces of herself. Her attorney, a woman named Bridget, who had done this kind of work for 20 years in Navajo County and approached it with the weary precision of someone who still cares despite the weariness, had prepped her well. The man making the claim to the children was not Denny, not the same family as the previous story, though the shape of the claim was similar. His name was Roland Longbow, her husband's older brother, and he had retained an attorney and had paperwork and had the particular composure of a man who believes he is right and has the patience to be right through institutional channels. I watched him during the hearing. He looked at Suki once, directly, and she looked back, and it was the kind of look that happens between people who have been in conflict long enough that the conflict has become part of the weather, present, ambient, not surprising anymore. Judge Carver deliberated for 40 minutes. I know because I sat in the hallway with a bad cup of coffee and counted time in my notebook by writing the things I observed. 11:03, couple leaves courtroom arguing. 11:17, Bridget comes out for water. 11:41, door opens. Bridget came out first. She had the face of someone whose client got what they needed, if not everything they wanted. Suki came out behind her. She sat down next to me on the bench. She said, "Temporary custody. 6 months, with review." She held the folder in her lap. "Full hearing in May." I said, That's good, Suki. "It's not permanent. It's a platform," I said. "It's what everything else gets built on." She looked at the folder. Stable address. Enrollment records. Documentation of care. She ran her thumb along the edge. "He did all of that. Without being asked." I knew she meant Hector. I said, "I know." She said, "I kept waiting for the catch." "Did you find one?" She was quiet for a long moment. "He just wants the noise," she said. And she sounded like someone who had been solving for a wrong variable for weeks and had finally found the right one and was still adjusting to the recalibration. "That's all. He just wants the noise his house makes now." I said, "Is that enough to build on?" She stood up. She straightened her jacket with her good arm. "I've built on less," she said. I drove her back. We stopped at a gas station outside Pinetop and I went in for water and she stayed in the truck, and when I came back she was on her phone, speaking in Apache, low and rapid, something warm in her voice that I hadn't heard before in the voice I knew, which was the prepared voice, the documented voice. This was something else. Older. She finished the call when I got in. I said, "Who was that?" She said, "My mother." She put the phone in her pocket. "She's in White River. She said she wants to see the kids." A pause. "She said she wants to meet the man who's been feeding them." I said, "Hector's going to be very uncomfortable about that." For the first time in 6 weeks, Suki Longbow laughed. Not long. Not big. The quick, surprised kind, like she'd forgotten she could. I went to the ranch the following Saturday. Marco's truck was back. He'd driven up Friday. He'd started doing that, driving up Fridays, going back Mondays, filling the weekend in a way that he was still pretending was about his father's situation rather than what I suspected it was actually about, which was the braiding sessions with Manny and the way Palomo had let him brush his flank without flinching and the general gravitational quality of a house full of people when you have been living alone and pretending that's fine. There was a rope on the fence. 12 feet, braided, lead rope thick. Hanging on the fence post near the barn gate with the specific intentionality of something placed rather than left. I stopped and looked at it. Manny was in the barn. He came to the door when he heard me and looked at where I was looking. He said, "I finished it." I said, "I see that. It's for Palomo," he said. "But Senor Vasquez said I should be the one to put it on him. The first time." He leaned against the doorframe. "I'm practicing. How to do it right." "Who's teaching you?" "Senor Vasquez." He looked at the rope. "He said there's a way to do it so the horse knows you're not taking anything from him. So he knows the rope is not the same as being caught." 9 years old. I looked at this 9-year-old boy in the barn doorway of a ranch that wasn't his, holding knowledge about ropes and horses and the difference between being caught and being chosen, and I thought, what are you going to do with all of this when you're grown? I thought, everything. The hard thing happened on the last Saturday. I've been putting off writing this part because writing it means deciding how I feel about it, and I'm still not entirely sure. It was evening. Hector and I were on the porch and the others were inside, and he said to me, without preamble, the way he says things, they're going to leave in the spring. I said, "What do you mean?" "After the May hearing. If it goes right, when it goes right, Bridget thinks it'll go right. Suki has plans. Her mother's in White River. She wants to be closer. She wants the kids near family." He looked at the mountain. "It makes sense." I said, "You knew this." "I knew it from the first week." He turned his coffee mug. "She never said it was permanent. She never let anyone think it was permanent." He paused. "She was very honest about that." She was honest from the beginning, I'll say that. I looked at him. And. He turned the mug the other way. And, Cora put a bolt in my jacket pocket last week. Without saying anything. I found it when I was putting the jacket away. He was quiet for a moment. I put it on the windowsill in my room. I didn't say anything. I have been trying, he said, to decide if that's a gift or if she does that with everyone, if it's just a thing she does. A pause. I don't know. I decided it doesn't matter which one it is. Why not? Because it's on the windowsill either way. He stood up. I'll keep it either way. He went inside. I drove home under a sky full of November stars, the kind that feel too close, and I thought about all the things I'd written in my notebook that didn't capture anything, and all the things I'd left out because I didn't have the words yet. I thought about Anna putting a drawing on Hector's refrigerator. About Manny and 12 feet of rope. About Suki at 5 a.m. at that table, managing her private terror, checking all the doors. About Hector making eggs. Always making eggs. The specific unceasing pragmatic love of a man who expresses everything through feeding people, who does not say I want you to stay or I will miss this or you changed something in me that I didn't know needed changing, who says instead, you want more eggs? I thought about the bolt on the windowsill. May came. The hearing went the way Bridget said it would go. Full custody to Suki. Roland Longbow's claim dismissed. The documentation held. The address held. The 6 months of careful, ordinary, accumulated life held. I was in the courthouse again. This time Hector drove. He parked and we all went in and we sat in the hallway and Marco, who had driven up from Phoenix the night before, kept checking his phone and putting it down and checking it again, which was the most anxious I'd ever seen him and probably the most anxious he'd been since adolescence. Suki came out and she said, "Done." And that was all she said, for a moment. She stood in the courthouse hallway holding her folder and looked at the wall straight ahead, and her composure was exactly where she'd kept it for 7 months, deployed, useful, doing its job, and then, something in it, very quietly, let go. Not collapsed. Not broke. Just let go. Like a person who has been holding a door shut for a very long time and, finally, feels what's on the other side isn't the thing they were afraid of. Anna said, "Mom." Suki turned. She put her good arm around her daughter, who had grown 2 inches since October, who had caught up in history and was now taking on math, who still did the dishes without being asked and still watched the road behind wherever they went but did it now from the back porch of a property that knew her name. They stood there. Hector looked at the floor. Marco looked at his phone and put it down and didn't pick it up again. They left in June. Suki's mother had a property outside White River, small but sufficient, with room for the children and a neighbor who'd offered paid work and a school that had been notified and a community that knew them or remembered them or was ready to know them again. The leaving was not dramatic. That's the thing I want to record accurately, it was not dramatic. There was no scene. Suki packed the same efficiency she'd arrived with the documents in the Ziploc bag when first, always first, a reflex she'd probably carry for years before she didn't need it anymore. The children packed with varying degrees of sentiment, Eli and Manny without ceremony, Anna carefully, Cora not at all because Cora's approach to the world was present tense and she had not yet developed an architecture for goodbye. Manny put Palomo's lead rope in his bag. Hector saw this. He didn't say anything. On the morning they left, Hector made eggs. An enormous amount of eggs, more than 7 people needed, the last deployment of his primary vocabulary. They ate at the table and it was loud and then, less loud and then, quiet. Anna did the dishes one last time. She dried her hands on the kitchen towel and hung it back exactly where it had been when they arrived and looked at Hector and said, "Thank you for the refrigerator." He looked at her. "My drawing," she said. "You kept it up the whole time." He said, "It's a good horse." She said, "I know." She picked up her bag and went to the truck. Cora, last, stood in front of Hector with her pockets full. She looked up at him. He crouched down to her level, which his niece protested, which he did not show. She took his hand. She put something in it. The S-hook. The one from her collection. The silver one. He looked at it. He looked at her. She turned and went to the truck. He stayed crouched for a moment after she was gone, his niece complaining, his hand closed around the S-hook, and I watched him from 20 feet away and I did not write anything in my notebook. Some things, I've decided this, after 7 notebooks and, for years, some things should be witnessed without being documented. Not because they're too large for words. Because they're exactly the right size for a person to hold privately, to put on a windowsill, to find again in the morning when the house is quiet and the noise is gone and, now, that the quiet is different than it was before. I drove out in July. Professional follow-up. Routine. Hector answered the door. The house was his again. 1 jacket on the hook. 4 cans of beans on the shelf, which I saw when I glanced at the pantry and which I did not comment on. But the drawings were still on the refrigerator. All of them, still there, even the faded ones from the earliest weeks, slightly curled at the corners now but held up with the same magnets, the 8-legged horses and the purple abstractions and the careful drawing of Palomo with his specific markings. He saw me looking. He said, "Coffee?" I said, "Yes." He put the kettle on. Outside, the grassland was going gold in the summer heat, and the ponderosas held their dark stubborn green, and Palomo stood in the east pasture and looked at nothing in particular with the equanimity of an animal that decided long ago that the world was okay and intended to keep deciding that. I opened my notebook. I didn't write anything. I closed it. Hector set the coffee down. We sat in the kitchen, in the house that had been full and was now quiet, and the quiet was different than it had been in October, inhabited differently, carrying something it hadn't carried before, the specific weight of a space that knows, now, what it can hold. He wrapped his hands around his mug. He said, "She called last week." I said, "Suki? Cora's starting preschool." He looked at the table. She said Cora told her teacher that her best friend is a horse named Palomo who lives in a different place. He turned his mug. She said the teacher didn't know what to do with that. I said, "What did you do with that?" He was quiet for a long moment. He said, "I laughed." The way he said it, surprised by himself, a little, the way you're surprised by a sound you didn't know you still made, landed in my chest in the specific way that means I'm going to be thinking about it for a while. I left an hour later. He stood at the gate and watched me go, the way he'd watched Suki's truck go in June, and I knew without looking back that he was already turning toward the barn, toward the morning's work, toward the ordinary and sustaining business of a life that had been changed in every way that can't be measured. The S-hook is on the windowsill. I'm sure of it. I didn't ask. I didn't need to.